well-known African theologians, they espoused a theology that was acceptable to Europeans, and that's why we know about them. The other Ethiopian and Nubian and Coptic theologians that I mentioned, their theology was not acceptable by European standards. It's acceptable by biblical standards, but it's not by Europeans, and that's why they were suppressed. And then the second and last reason, Athanasius, and it is important. They were African. They were from Egypt or from North Africa, and because they wrote in European languages, in Greek and Latin, they were allowed to become influential. And also, this is also important. And so I think again, but the problem is that a lot of that. That history is not known. And so even some of the things I'm saying right now, like, are brand new to me, and they're oftentimes new to others, but it's not known because, it didn't affect Western Christianity and the Western world. And I think it's good to look at how early Africans did influence, like, so much, for example, so much of Western Christianity was largely influenced by several African theologians, like Augustine is probably the biggest one, like even your name. And so, Augustine is one of the most influential theologians for the West in church history. Talked about the doctrine of original sin and, argued against the Pelagians. And he also, really in City of God, put forth one of the most just in-depth theologies of church-state relations and just war, and a lot of things that really ended up affecting how, during the times of the Crusades and the Carolingians and just the further development of the Western world was largely influenced by Augustine's thought. But then even earlier than him, you have other people like Athanasius and Origen and Cyril of Alexandria, who were some of these other North African theologians who were also very influential in Western Christianity. Tertullian was a North African theologian earlier than Augustine, but in the same area. He was the first theologian to write in Latin, and he's the first theologian to use the word Trinity, which is extremely influential. So you have all of these North African theologians who were very influential on Western Christianity, and that is important to look at. But again, I just also think it's important to, I think people have heard the names Augustine, Tertullian, Cyril, Athanasius, and it is important. They were African. They were from Egypt or from North Africa, and because they wrote in European languages, in Greek and Latin, they were allowed to become influential. And also, this is also important, because they lived before the time of a very important schism between the majority of Christians in Africa and in Europe, which was the Council of Chalcedon in 451. It was after that time period where the majority of Christians in Egypt and Nubia and in Ethiopia, and then the other Christians that spread into West Africa and in Central Africa, almost all of those Christians in the continent of Africa from the year 451 going like up until the arrival of European colonists in the 16th century, most of them were not in agreement with the theology of Europe, which developed after the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And so that is another reason why we don't hear about other names. There are other names of Christians that continue to develop in Africa that we don't often hear about, like people like Benjamin of Alexandria, or Timothy Elorus, or Zara Yacob, or Walata Petros, or Georgius of Sagla, or we don't hear about texts like the Nicene Canons, or the Miracle of Saint Mina. These are people and these are texts that came from Egypt, from Nubia, from Ethiopia after the time of Chalcedon, and because they did not espouse the European theology, they were suppressed by the European Christians for a very long time, until they became doubly suppressed when Islam came into North Africa and suppressed a lot of Christianity. And not only and so their history has been really neglected, and that's why that second list of names I said probably would be a lot less familiar than the first list of names that I said. And there's a reason for that. And there's two reasons. Like I said, number one, the more well-known African theologians, they espoused a theology that was acceptable to Europeans, and that's why we know about them. The other Ethiopian and Nubian and Coptic theologians that I mentioned, their theology was not acceptable by European standards. It's acceptable by biblical standards, but it's not by Europeans, and that's why they were suppressed. And then the second and last reason is because those other names I mentioned, they did not write in European languages. They wrote in Coptic, in Nubian, in Ethiopian or Ge'ez, and that's why they're not as well known. See, we know about Tertullian and Augustine and Athanasius because they wrote in Greek, and it wasn't only the language they wrote, but they also wrote in a very European way. Like Augustine, he influenced the West, but also the West influenced him because he was largely really shaped and influenced by a lot of, people like Ambrose of Milan or even Roman pagan, philosophers like Cicero. And so his writing style and other, Greek and Latin, North African fathers and mothers, their writing style was more approachable to Europeans or to Romans. But a lot of these Ethiopian or Nubian theologians, they wrote in a way that was much more indigenous, I would say, to the culture. Ethiopian authors that I mentioned, they wrote in unique styles of literature called dersan that were exegetical, but also communal and a theological and also historical communal history, a way of doing theology that even the genre of literature itself is only unique to the Ethiopian context that people like Georgius or Zari Kob wrote in. They had music called the Degwa music that were unique to Ethiopian culture. They had systems of philosophy called Kine philosophy. So these are things that did not influence Western culture because they suppressed it. And so again, I think there were many ways that North Africans, because they were more Europeanized or more Romanized, were able to influence a lot of Western Christianity and then therefore global Christianity. But I also think it's important to look at the other theologians that wrote in African languages and wrote in African genres of literature and had a theology that was unique, much more uniquely African. It was actually different from, it was even actually hostile with the doctrine of the Roman Empire. But it was actually a lot more prominent and influential across the whole continent of Africa. And so despite Western Christian persecution and suppression, indigenous, I would say, even to larger degrees, indigenous African Christian theology had a lot more juice on the African continent than even some of the well-known authors did. And that's why we need to also know those names and know those contexts and even reconnect with a lot of, the Christianity that was prevalent even in the places where our ancestors came from, and really reconnect with that ways that the Middle Passage and racism and colonialism for the last 500 years has really cut us off from a lot of those sub-Saharan African traditions. We need to reconnect with those, if that kind of makes sense.